Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to Rainfall and Reservoirs Water Year Wrap Up, which is Sonoma Water's inaugural webinar marking the close of Water Year 2025 and the start of Water Year 2026. This webinar is being recorded. Once posted to Sonoma Water's YouTube channel, it will also feature a Spanish translation. I'm Linda Hopkins, Chair of the Sonoma Water Board of Directors and also the Sonoma County Board of Supervisors. And today I am joined by a wonderful panel of experts who will be sharing insight on reservoirs, water supply, and the forecast for the year ahead. The folks who are joining me are Nick Malasavage, the Chief of the Operations and Readiness Division for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and he'll be discussing operations at Lake Sonoma and Lake Mendocino and provide an overview of our regional water supply system. We also are joined by Don Seymour, Sonoma Water's Deputy Director of Engineering, and we'll review how recent water years have affected current supplies and how we're planning for the future. Janine Jones, our Interstate Resources Manager with the California Department of Water Resources, will be talking about subseasonal to seasonal forecasts and the outlook for the coming winter. Before we begin, I want to give a quick primer on what a water year is. The concept actually began in 1911 when USGS began measuring the hydrological year starting in October. This approach captured the beginning of precipitation in the western states when stream flows and reservoirs are typically at their lowest. So it creates a clear cutoff between our dry summers and our wetter winters. A new water year begins on October 1st and ends on September 30th. And fun fact, that used to be the federal fiscal year until 1976. So now we have three different types of years. We have the calendar year, we have the water year, and we have our fiscal year, which is July through June. As we reflect on one water year ending and another beginning, our focus will be the Russian River system. If you rely on a private well, today's discussion may have less of a direct impact. We'll be concentrating on the water supply system that delivers drinking water to more than 600,000 residents in parts of Sonoma and Marin counties. And we'll be using Zoom's Q&A function to respond to questions after we finish with today's presentations. You can find the Q&A button in the controls at the bottom of the Zoom screen. So I am now going to hand it over to Nick from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who will be sharing a presentation with us.
Good morning, folks. My intent this morning is to kind of do a walkthrough or drive through of what the water years that we just experienced. Just a quick overview spatially. We got two counties of our watershed and two of our lakes, Lake Mendocino, Lake Sonoma. I think one of the things I often have to remind myself as a citizen of this watershed is that a little less than 20% of the watershed is actually behind these lakes. So that's 80+% that is unregulated or free to flow to the river. Both facilities, primary function, flood risk reduction, flood protection, that's us, the Corps of Engineers, and then water supply, Sonoma Water. Our operations are dictated by a playbook, a water control manual that have some certain rules based on the conditions in the lake, conditions of water on the ground, and now what's going to happen into the future. We are now operating under concept and implementation of forecast-informed reservoir options. So what is FIRO? It's the I. We are informed by the forecast. We're not controlled, but we are able to look at the forecast going ahead to make better, more efficient decisions for the sake of public safety, water security, and honestly, enjoying the lakes. What has it been before? We used to be able to just look at forecasts for water that's on the ground. So not for us, but for others, snow that melts, but water that's already fallen on the ground. So now, or what did that do in the past is that even if we had blue skies, even if we had good weather and safe conditions, we just simply had to evacuate that storage and restore our flood control pool. But a better way to think about flood control pools is it's actually like the flood control airspace. This is the space that we reserve to accept big inflows from winter storms and not have to put it into the river, but wait for blue skies to do just that. So in the next slides, I'll just kind of talk about what happened and why, what was informing our decisions, what were our decisions, and a little bit about what would have happened without FIRO. First, Lake Mendocino. Just to orient around this, we have our lake level, which is that up and down gray line. We have our allowable or top of conservation. So the difference between the Corps of Engineers making flow release decisions is above that solid black line. Sonoma water is below. The blue is the cumulative rainfall. So big spikes and jumping up is some big storms. And then that dash line is what we call of our top of FARO storage. It's important to note that we are on the cusp of actually finishing a water control manual update to make it permanent. This is operating the FARO, make that permanent for Lake Mendocino. And then we have some ongoing efforts to look into that at Lake Sonoma. In general, first up, green. What's happening here? The lake rises to above the top of conservation, and now with the information of a forecast and the ability to make a decision, this green block indicates what we call a pre-release. This is actually where we got rid of water before the storm hit. Why do we do that? Well, we're above the top of conservation, and this storm in particular, the inflows were going to push our lake way up. So knowing that we could safely put water into the river before those natural flows hit, we made that decision. Moving on later, when that big storm was realized, that pushed us up above even that FARO space. At that point, we then wait for blue skies, safe conditions on the river, which if you look down to the rain, the cumulative rainfall, there are some storms in there where you see that little lump where we're holding on to water, but then we safely release water, and then we actually hang out at the top of that FARO space. Moving forward in time, another big storm on the horizon, and we once again impart a pre-release. Same conditions as before. Big storm coming in, very low risk to water security, but some padding on flood control and flood risk management. At the end of the day, we have the obligation to manage that space to ensure flood risk reduction downstream. Big storm hits, lake pops up again. We're pretty much way up. So we have to reduce, or we'll say restore that airspace. And we kind of move down to this dash line top of FARO again. We then have another storm hit. It pushes the lake up, but here we are nearing the end of the flood control season, or we'll say the storm season. And in this case, just kind of use my slang. We sort of let it ride here. We know the pool goes up. We know we should be reducing that airspace, but we also contemplate, hey, we have a pretty good period here of dry weather. Our allowable storage is actually going up with time, and we're emerging from the stormy season in the watershed itself. So at the end of the day, you could sort of visualize that if we didn't have Forecast-Informed Reservoir Ops, we would have been dumping water every time we got above that solid black line. Yes, at the end of the season, maybe those storms we would have ridden up below that solid black line, but we don't need to do that anymore. Moving to Lake Sonoma, a little bit more of the same. Very different reservoir as far as storage goes. But we have our big storm in November. Everybody remembers that one. Pool shoots up. Then we have some storms in December that pushes our pool up. We're just kind of getting into the meat of a rather wet season. So we pull it back down to that dash line. That's our allowable storage where we can sit above the top of con safely if we have a decent forecast, or I should say a dry forecast. Another storm hits and we do a similar flood control release to get back down to that allowable storage. And then we have I would say a long dry period. So we know that we could just hang out at that added storage. And then just like at Lake Mendocino, here at Lake Sonoma, we see another big storm coming, and we effect a pre-release just to give us a little bit more of that airspace, just in case the forecast changes, it gets wetter, it gets more aggressive. We add that airspace, pool goes up, we get the pool down, another storm, pool goes up. And in this space, you can see that we get rid of the water, but we also sort of taper that out. So that's the steepness of this line. We know, hey, it is February. It still could rain quite a bit at this point. We need to pull down the pool, but hey, it actually looks like the forecast is drying out. We could do this in moderation. We don't have to stand on the gas to get down to that dash line or the solid line. And then through into the end of the season, you see a little bit of that going on, a little bit of rain, a little bit of flood control release, but moderated by that reality of some dry weather as well as emerging from the flood control season. So, kind of just pausing here, what was functionally different with FIRO for both of these lakes? I think it's important. I forgot to point it out on Lake Mendocino, but we have some spaces where I would call it a no action decision or no flood control release. This now includes space that's above the top of conservation. It used to only be we're doing nothing if it's pounding rain and more water's coming in because it's not safe downstream. So we hang on to water. Now we have blue sky dry and we say, hey, no action, no flood control release because conditions downstream are safe. Forecast is dry. We don't have to aggressively restore that airspace. Other thing, pre-releases. This includes in extreme events, which we didn't necessarily have one in this last water year, but with the new water control manual update at Lake Mendocino, we also have the commitment of Sonoma Water to dig into the water supply space. So this program, although it's hanging the pool higher in years like the one we've experienced, this technology in this program also allows for the use of water supply space to burnish our flood risk mission. So we actually could gain more airspace with a solid forecast. Talked about moderation as we emerge from the flood season, from the heavy rain season. We know that our risk is decaying and declining. We can think about that with dry forecasts as well as the time in the year. And the bottom line is we're ending the year with deeper water. What does that mean? It's just higher water quality, colder for people and for fish. And a thing close to my heart, enjoying these lakes. As a citizen in this watershed, deeper water usually means safer for recreators, for boating, for swimming in areas that typically do have swimming. The other aspect too is we just simply have less frequent and less intense flood control releases, which means we're putting less water downstream, potentially adding to risk or even just adding to the time it takes to get back to low risk. So with forecasts, we can reduce our flood control releases. We can get smarter about our flood control releases. We can enhance how much airspace we can get in extreme events, and we can contribute to water security in the region, safe recreation, etc. And that's all I got for this morning.
Thank you so much, Nick. And also just really appreciate the partnership with the Army Corps of Engineers and how willing you've always been to share information and clear up any misconceptions about what it is that the Army Corps does. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Don Seymour from Sonoma Water for another presentation.
Thank you very much, Director Hopkins. Here, let me bring up my presentation. So I know, can everybody say this okay?
Yes, Don, it's in the, it's not in presentation mode, but we can see it.
How's that?
Perfect.
So I know my colleague Nick showed this slide also. It's the Russian River watershed. And he described it kind of from the flood risk management perspective. I just wanted to touch bases from the perspective of Sonoma Water, who has the water supply management responsibilities in the Russian River. And so first of all, Nick pointed out Lake Mendocino. It's in the upper portion of the figure, just outside of the city of Ukiah. It's was the first reservoir built in 1959. And as he mentioned, the Corps operates it for flood control management, and Sonoma Water operates it to make releases from the water supply pool to meet obligations for minimum stream flow requirements in the main stem Russian River, but also for diversions by water right holders that are authorized to use water that's been stored and released from Lake Mendocino. One thing I want to point out, between the two reservoirs, Lake Mendocino and Lake Sonoma, you can see there, water supply pool, Lake Mendocino, 68,400 acre feet between November 1 and March 1. Then after March 1, it increases by about 600 acre feet till May 10th to a total of 111,000 acre feet. But if you look at Lake Sonoma, water supply pool, 245,000 acre feet. It's a significantly larger reservoir. And along with that, its watershed is a lot more productive. And so with having the variable water supply pool that doesn't start to increase till March, we face water supply issues of making sure there's enough water stored in Lake Mendocino to meet all its obligations. Lake Sonoma is again down outside this west of the city of Healdsburg. Both water supply and flood control responsibilities at the reservoir. Sonoma Water makes the releases from that reservoir to meet minimum stream flow requirements in Dry Creek, but then also to supplement main stem water coming in that confluence with the main stem Russian River to make sure we're meeting those minimum stream flow requirements all the way downstream to Jenner in the Pacific Ocean. And I would just also point out a water resource that has been very important to the Russian River watershed for well over a century. So if you go up to the very kind of upper corner of that figure, you see Lake Pillsbury and Cape Horn Dam and what is the Potter Valley Project. That project is a hydroelectric project that's owned by the Pacific Gas and Electric Company that's been in operation, as I mentioned, for almost 120 years. And historically, it was the source of a significant transfer of Eel River water into the Russian River system, much of it captured by Lake Mendocino up until about the early 2000s. Up until that point, the average transfer on a yearly basis was about 150,000 acre feet per year. That's significantly changed due to issues with infrastructure at the project and licensing changes with the project. And so that 150,000 is now about 40,000 acre feet per year. And so I just wanted to show, this next slide kind of shows the rainfall, cumulative rainfall totals of what we saw for our last water year, as Director Hopkins mentioned, starting October 1 and running to the end of September. And just a couple of things I want to point out is that that blue line represents the cumulative rainfall at the airport in the city of Ukiah, and the green line represents cumulative rainfall at the the Santa Rosa Airport, Sonoma County Airport, just outside Santa Rosa. Couple things to notice, it was a little bit wetter in the southern portion of the watershed versus the northern portion. Just would also like to point out that the rainfall was pretty well distributed. We started seeing significant precipitation in the middle of November, and then it went all the way through. We were receiving rain events all the way through the end of April. And so really well distributed. And so that really allowed that water to be captured based on how, Nick was describing their operations with Forecast-Informed Reservoir Operations. Having these dispersed storms really allowed them to leverage those FIRO procedures to capture that water in both the reservoirs. And I think one other thing just to point out about this slide is you notice that November storm, it was a really pretty big storm event. And that's that type of storm event we really like to see kick off the early part of the water year, because it really saturates the watershed. It brings up base flows in the tributaries and the main stem. And particularly in the main stem, it means Sonoma Water can start reducing those releases from the reservoir, start preserving that storage. And then having that saturated watershed after a big event like that, these subsequent storm events create the runoff that actually really fills these reservoirs, both the reservoirs. And so from another perspective on this rainfall, the blue line represents the 30-year average for both the Ukiah rainfall gauge and the Santa Rosa rainfall gauge. And as you can notice, for the Ukiah area, the rainfall was met the 30-year average. But for the Santa Rosa gauge, it was about 24% in greater rainfall than the 30-year average. So really for the southern part of the county, really a much wetter, wetter year, which was really responsible for, really saturating the watershed, filling our reservoirs. And we really saw, this type of precipitation actually since, 2023 and 2024. So we've really had 3 very nice wet water years. So I know this slide is super busy, but it's basically kind of in ways, it was the slide Nick showed. As you can see the division of the water conservation pool at the flood control pool, the Army Corps' airspace, that's that light dash line. And then the FIRO line is the darker line above it. Each of those other solid lines just represents storage in the reservoir for different water years. And the one line really to pick out right now is that solid black line. that represents the change in storage over the past year at Lake Mendocino, starting in October and then just about to end in September. As you can see, it has been, really high storage in the reservoir, similar to what we saw in 2023 and 2024 and 2019, the blue line, again, these very wet water years. And then you can see the storage level, much lower in the reservoir. 2021, we saw the reservoir get to its lowest level, just over 12,000 acre feet by in October. And so these kind of show the comparison of what we've seen since 2019. Severe drought, and then I would say, these nice above normal water years. And this next slide is of Lake Sonoma. Again, you can see the flat light dash gray line, which is at 245,000 acre feet, the top of the water conservation pool. The darker dash line represents the FURO pool that the Corps can, at their discretion, can store flood water in if decision support tools and forecasts are indicating it's safe to do so. That FURO pool actually in the winter is at about 9,500 acre feet above the conservation pool, and then it starts increasing February 16th to March 1 to 19,000 acre feet above the conservation pool. And again, the black dash line represents this year, very similar to 2023 and 2024, almost identical. They're basically overlapping as they come out of the wet season into the dry year. So again, kind of these above normal wet years that have really leveraged both the FURO pools at both the reservoirs. Collectively, over the last 3 years, each of the last 3 years, those FURO procedures and FURO pools have resulted in the Army Corps and Sonoma Water Operations having an additional 30,000 acre feet between the two reservoirs. And just to put that in perspective, if you think about the storage in Lake Mendocino, maximum storage 111, it's like over the last 3 years, we've created a Lake Mendocino, really a great water resource, water year story. And then again, you see some of those lower storage levels where we really depleted the reservoirs in the drought of 2020 through 2022. So where are we going? This is again just showing the conservation pool and FURO pool at Lake Mendocino. Again, that solid black line is actual storage in the reservoir, and those colored lines represent Sonoma Water's best forecasting of what we might see over the next year. That gold line represents, well, if we see a similar year to what would have occurred over the last one of these wetter years. That green line is more of an average year, and then that goldish line, well, that's if we experience another dry year. So pretty significant uncertainty in what we're facing. I wish we could do something. We had a better way of forecasting of what we're going to see in the next 3 to 6 or 2 to 3 months. But right now, this is kind of what the best we can do. Now, my co-panelists, Janine, will actually be getting into what the state is doing to try to give us a better understanding and reduce some of that uncertainty and bring those lines closer together so that we have a better idea of what we can really expect 2 to 3 months out. And this is the same figure for Lake Sonoma. Again, the solid black is where we're at right now. I would just point out, we're not too much below that the top of the conservation pool. It's not going to take too much precipitation to bump us back up, and that's really, again, leveraging that additional 19,000 acre feet that the Corps was able to preserve in the reservoir this year by exercising FURO procedures. And again, those, the same, the yellowish line is if we have a wet year and we very quickly get to the top of the FURO pool, it flattens out because the Corps is going to have to make releases to keep it from going above that line. The green line represents more of a normal year, kind of the 50th percentile. And then the gold line below it represents for a really dry year. And just kind of getting back again to the size of these reservoirs, yeah, that gold line is at a declining trend, but even at the, coming at January 1, no real rainfall, the reservoir is still storing 210,000 acre feet, just 35,000 acre feet below the top of that conservation pool. So, just the magnitude of this reservoir and the productiveness of its watershed really make it a tremendous asset to the water resources of this region. And that's all I have, Director Hopkins.
Thank you so much for the excellent and informative presentation, Don. Next up, we are going to be hearing from Janine Jones with the California Department of Water Resources, and she'll be closing out the presentation with a discussion on the importance of a reliable subseasonal to seasonal, or S2S, because we always have to have acronyms in government, forecasts to help us manage our reservoirs and infrastructure for both the water supply, pool, as well as flood protection. Janine? And Janine, I can't hear you. There we go. Perfect. Looks like you're starting the screen share.
Yeah, there we go. So you should see it in presentation mode momentarily. So I'll be talking about what can we realistically expect for the upcoming season. So, and I need to start out by talking about where are we right now in the water cycle, because this influences how the initial part of the new water year comes out. As Don just alluded to, your initial conditions influence the early part of your season and what happens with runoff from early storms. So basically, at a statewide perspective, we are abnormally average statewide for the second year in a row. And if we look specifically at the North Coast, which includes Sonoma County, similar thing, a little bit above average, nothing hugely significant. And if we look at the statewide picture geographically speaking, we see Northern California is wetter than Southern California, which, is really just an intensification of what normally occurs in our climatology. Looking at temperature, because temperature is very important for what goes on during the water year, very uniformly across the entire western U.S., just a little bit warmer than average, certainly nothing like we saw in our record-breaking drought years in terms of heat. So this is almost a new normal for us, a little warmer than average. And if we look specifically at the North Coast, same setting, a little bit warmer than average, nothing terribly significant. Looking now, zooming in on the last several months, because that's what really influences soil moisture and such as we go into the wet season. Again, a little bit warmer, nothing hugely significant. And we could also look at a metric called the evaporative demand drought index, which looks at evaporative demand, or the thirst of the atmosphere, and its relationship to evapotranspiration, or the amount of water that plants need. And if you go into the wet season with lots of those dark reds and oranges in your area, that suggests that you will be paying a tax to the environment in your early storms in terms of runoff. Hard to tell from the scale of this graph, but that area of enhanced evaporative demand drought index in the last few months is really more Central Coast and down into the San Joaquin Valley. Nothing to be terribly concerned about for the Sonoma County part of the world. So basically, as we go into the wet season, we are in fairly neutral conditions, especially compared to some of our prior years, water year 2023, which was very soggy, or our drought years prior to that. So we're going in, kind of in a very neutral condition with respect to what happens next. Look at reservoir storage. Well, we're pretty much about average statewide. Groundwater storage has recovered to some extent in the last few years, certainly not in the San Joaquin Valley, which is an area of significant challenge with respect to groundwater conditions. But overall, pretty much even table, or evenly set table as we go forward. Now here's the NOAA official forecast. And I'm showing the outlook for December, January, and February because those 3 months represent 50% of California's average annual water supply. What you're seeing here is a classic La Nina pattern with a drier in the southern part of the country. Now, this map shows the skill measured by a metric called a Heidecke skill score that meteorologists use. And white areas on the map mean no more skill than just predicting average weather conditions. Blue areas means that your prediction was actually worse than predicting average, and the warmer tones indicate a little bit better. But the Heidecke on the you did better than average side goes up to a score of 100. We see a little bit of California, including part of this area, is maybe in the 10 to 20 range, but that's 10 to 20 out of 100. So what that is practically saying is there's no skill in the NOAA forecast, and that's something we've known for a long time. And in particular, we can look at past water years, like our very wet 2023, for example, and see that they basically got it completely wrong. So this is why you really don't take the NOAA outlooks seriously, because they're simply not accurate. Now, why are they not accurate? NOAA started doing these in the mid-1990s when they had just, so to speak, discovered El Nino Southern Oscillation, or ENSO, which has three phases: La Nina, El Nino, or neutral. Well, the problem is that in much of the country, including California and the Colorado River Basin, which is important for Southern California, ENSO doesn't really provide a signal. Work that we funded UCLA to do shows that it contributes about 25% to California's precipitation. Works that we funded the Scripps Institution of Oceanography to do shows that one reason for California in particular that it's not a good signal is because of these little things called atmospheric rivers that we're all familiar with. And if you were to look at the North Coast drainage and break out El Nino, La Nina, and neutral years, there's really not much difference among all those dots. For California, La Nina, which is the phase of ENSO that we expect to be going into, does tend to mean drier for Southern California, but that's the only place in the state that any phase of ENSO has any real predictability. So this is why you don't pay a lot of attention to the outlooks that are based on ENSO. Now, as DWR, with partners in other agencies and including Sonoma Water, we have been working on an effort to get legislative direction and funding for NOAA to improve its forecasting. There have been two National Academy of Sciences reports in the last decade or so that say, if you just made some investment in the forecasting, you could get there. So we have been sponsoring improvements to S2S forecasting in congressional legislation. And if you would like to look at our website through a QR code instead, I'm providing the QR code. Basically, there's a piece of legislation that we colloquially call the Weather Act, which was introduced in the prior session of Congress, passed out of the House with our language in it for S2S forecasting, but the Senate simply ran out of time to take it up at the end of the congressional session. We have once again reintroduced it in the current session, and we hope that it makes it out this time. What it would do is fund NOAA and explicitly direct them to do some pilot projects for improving S2S forecasting, including one for water management in the western U.S., which is something that we sorely need. So as I wrap up here with these remarks, really all we can say about the coming water year is that the forecasts really have no skill. We know that California has a highly variable climate, and we always need to be prepared for either wet or dry conditions because, within the last decade, certainly, we've had both very wet and very dry. So this is where I stop and turn it back to Linda.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Janine. Appreciate it. And I always appreciate any presentation that includes ENSO, which is something that I studied back in the day. And I don't know if you remembered to give the acronym, but it is El Nino Southern Oscillation, and it's determined by sea surface temperatures across the equatorial and other parts of the Pacific. So always fun to learn how those global impacts may or may not actually impact our water year locally. Really appreciate all of the informative presentations from our panelists today. One of those key takeaways that Janine mentioned is the importance of the S2S forecasting. Really, to protect and serve our communities, we need continued investment in an implementation of these forecasts at the local level. Without that, it's really challenging for us to be able to actually manage our water effectively. As we move into water year 2026, the reliable science and strong partnerships across all of the entities involved in this panel are going to be absolutely critical at guiding our efforts to balance water supply and flood protection. Just a reminder for everyone to go ahead and put your questions into the Q&A function. And if there are more questions than we have time for, we will absolutely make sure that we post those to sonomawater.org. And what we also just post weekly updates actually about all of this data. So you don't have to wait for a webinar. You can monitor it in real time year round. I'm going to go ahead and start with, I think, a really critical question. And it kind of open this, I think, to anyone. But, Fred asks, with NOAA cutbacks, how accurate will forecasts be? Will forecasts be less apt? And so I don't know if Dawn or Janine, you might have some thoughts on this.
I'll take an initial shot, Director Hopkins. So we have not seen a decline in the quality of the California-Nevada River Forecast Center, which is the branch of NOAA that provides forecasts for the Russian River, inflows to both Lake Mendocino, Lake Sonoma, flows at different reaches of the river. However, I would say because of the cutbacks, we are certainly concerned and will be watching very closely, because the quality of those forecasts are what allow Nick and his crew to have confidence to either make determinations to preserve water in that FERO space, or to make releases to create airspace for big events. Nick, I'm sure you have some thoughts on that too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, everything Don said is spot on. And I mean, for what it's worth, it's one of the things that we monitor on a regular basis, the quality of the forecast as we learn. So kind of even before we were fully implementing forecast-informed reservoir options, we all had our certain professional anxieties in learning this technology throughout the years with a stable forecast and assuming that stable forecast is going to go into the future. But we've become much more aware about how forecasts land, their intensity, and ultimately the effect on reservoir operations. And we'll continue to do that.
And I might chime in here. The kinds of forecasts that Nick and Don were just talking about are an operational weather forecast. And NOAA makes those out to 10 days in advance. Most of the forecast skill is in the first 7 days. And that's really what's being used for FERO, for example. When we talk about the S2S timescale, we're talking about going out, 6 weeks, 2 months, really anything beyond 2 weeks. And NOAA has never really made any investment there to speak of, other than this effort that began in the mid-90s with the Climate Prediction Center, and is just a very minimal effort. And really on that side of the equation, that's where we're trying to get them to really step up and start investing in the first place, because NOAA historically has been much more focused on the flood control, or the short-term life safety, as they call it, flood risk management, and not so much on the water supply side.
Great. Thank you for those answers. Next question from L. Frost, which is kind of a broad question, and so I think open-ended to all of you. How are we collaborating with fish and wildlife resources and agencies?
Very, very much so. So the FERO program has been going on since 2014, starting as a pilot at Lake Mendocino. And as Nick mentioned, about to have the flood control manual update that'll formalize those procedures. And now we're focusing on Lake Sonoma. Both the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries have been significantly involved in that initiative and have had tremendous amount of input into forecast-informed reservoir operations. But on top of that, in 2008, National Marine Fisheries issued a biological opinion for both Sonoma County Water Agency's actions on the Russian River in reservoir operations and the Army Corps. So, and they recently, NIMS recently released a second biological opinion in April 2025, which both the Corps and Sonoma Water have been collaborating at a huge level in the development of those documents. So there is tremendous collaboration with the two main fish agencies, being the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries.
I would also add that the depth of the drought had its own consequences in our hatchery programs, and realizing how FIRO can not eliminate the impacts of a 3-year drought, but can moderate and attenuate some of the more extreme experiences. So warmer water daylighted some pathogens in our hatchery programs, and naturally, just with less water in the watershed, fewer streams had water in them. So FIRO, I mentioned about water quality, really about a deeper pool being colder water for a longer time, has with the fisheries agencies, it's acutely understood and championed as it relates to FIRO.
Thank you so much, Nick. Anything to add, Janine?
No, at the S2S scale, this is really a longer term research activity, and better forecasts at longer time scales benefits everyone: water supply, fishery managers, power production, so agriculture, certainly. So everyone would benefit from it.
Thank you. And I just want to add, in response to that question, that it's really an honor to be part of Sonoma Water, because these folks that you see for an hour together on this panel are not just here for 1 hour to talk to you. They're actually coordinating and collaborating in real time, and including with other fish and wildlife, resources and agencies. And so partly maybe it's almost like having gone through the fires together, having gone through droughts and floods together really brings government into a closer coordination and collaboration. And so I can guarantee that all of us are working together and rowing in the same direction. And it's actually really lovely to see the relationships that have been built and the trust that has been built across these agencies over the years. Great question from Rue, which is, has a sounding in Lake Sonoma been done to ascertain storage capacity since the bigger storm events that may have caused greater siltation, raising the bottom and reducing capacity for storage? I'm going to maybe hand this one over to Nick.
Yeah, we're actually in the process of scoping what that would look like, and trying to, the next time we have a high pool, to get into some higher areas. We have some technologies at the district that allow us to get into shallower water. One of the things is, in one of the arms, the trees that were left in place for good fishing tend to obfuscate where the actual bottom is, and we're trying to scope and figure out how do we overcome that, with, we'll say our typical hydro survey equipment is going to get confused by that. But yeah, typically we worry most about where the outlet works is. And some preliminary soundings have said, nothing really down at we'll say at the drain of the bathtub. But getting into the higher areas, also with the drought, there was definitely some movement of material from the original construction. But I'm sorry to have a roundabout answer to say we're seeking to figure that out, to raise our confidence in what we're dealing with now, 40 plus years into operating this project.
Thank you so much, Nick. And I think that this one will probably be for you as well. And this is from Charles. Were there any river flooding consequences of applying the FIRO curve? Also, what determines how much or how quickly you draw down the reservoir in advance of a storm? And I hope it's okay now that I out you as one of my bosses. Nick actually lives in one of our lower Russian River communities. And so we have coordinated, very closely during our events in the lower Russian River. And I will say that there are always, let's just say, conspiracy theories about, oh, this was the Army Corps flooding out our communities. And I want everyone to know that that is not the case. And that, Nick and his entire team work very, very hard to actually mitigate the flooding in the lower Russian River. And that if we did not have the dam in place, we would actually have much more severe impacts. And so all of the data also is publicly available online. And maybe you could also mention that, Nick, where we're actually have an ability to monitor the outputs, in real time, so that folks can see that actually the water is being held back during those peak flooding events. So with that, I'll kick it over to you, Nick, and Dawn probably would also like to chime in on this as well.
Sure. Were there any consequences to applying FARO? No. As a member of a flood control agency, we have great anxiety about never letting that happen. And the bottom line is you can go to the California Data Exchange, that's CDEC. They flop our data. You could type in USACE WCDS Russian River. That'll get you to one of our sister districts where you can see all this data. And yeah, the reality is we're just making fewer flood control releases. One of the curious things that is how FARO affects our decision making is in these pre-releases, and even modest pre-releases where we put a little bit of that pool into the river before the rain shows up is really giving us the capacity to store more water. But whenever the rain is hitting and the rain is falling, we are holding back. And you can see that our releases during storms are low to trivial. And then we wait for that falling leg of a hydrograph, usually a day or two post-storm as the river's going down, if it's not down already, before we make flood control releases, which the second part of your question is like what determines how quickly. Where I was flashing up when we have these periods of dry weather, when we see a modest or a pretty intense storm coming, that informs how aggressive are we going to get water out of the reservoir. We, at the end of the day, each of our reservoirs has a certain plumbing capacity. And we think, hey, we can only safely release 6,000 to 7,000 CFS through either of our facilities. And we have a big inflow, a big storm coming. And as you start to put this algebra together, that informs how much volume do we want to turn from water into air to receive that next storm. But yeah, FARO dry forecasts, those 10 days or maybe even 15 days of dry forecasts, there tends to be a lot of confidence in a dry forecast staying dry. And then the intensity of a wet forecast is how we figure out how much and how quickly. I hope that scratches some of that itch.
That was great. Don, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I would just follow up on a comment you made, Director Hopkins, on the collaboration is way well beyond this 1 hour event we're having right now. When we're entering into those forecasted storms coming and very active management season, there are daily or bi-daily emails being exchanged between Sonoma Water, the Army Corps, and the California Nevada River Forecast Center. So the communication is incredible. And I would point out one Friday night at 7 o'clock, being on a call with you, Patrick Singh of the Corps, Grant Davis, our general manager, and Nick Malsavage, because of concerns of what was going to happen downstream. And so that collaboration, you're right, is going on all the time.
Yeah. The other thing that I just want to mention that I think sometimes folks sort of struggle to, grasp is that we also, even though you have an overall forecast, how the water falls in different sub watersheds makes a huge impact in terms of local flooding impact. So I remember in 2019, for instance, there were homes in Cazadero that had never flooded before, and it was because Austin Creek got hammered. That sub watershed had so much, there were entire redwood trees floating down that thing. And then when it hit the river that was already high, right, it backed up, towards Cazadero. And so, sometimes we do see these extreme local flooding, events that really don't have any nexus actually to what the Army Corps is doing, but with actually just the pattern of the rain and exactly kind of where it fell within that watershed. And so sometimes we hear concerns from the community that are beyond the scope of anything that can be controlled by the Army Corps as well.
Well, Nick made a great point earlier. The two reservoirs only impair about 18% of the watershed. So 82% of the watershed is unimpaired, and it's a very large watershed that can generate a huge amount of runoff when we see these atmospheric river events.
Yeah. Another question from Fred: are the public trust lawsuits in Sonoma County of concern for UWMP and supply forecasts? What chance is there for the public trust angle to disrupt water supply plans? I feel like that's probably a question for the attorneys, but Dawn, do you want to take a stab at that?
I will take a stab at that, but I agree that I think that's a question for our attorneys. I think one thing that's different than some of those lawsuits that are going on, that those are retailers down in Southern California. Just want to point out Sonoma County Water Agency is a wholesale water provider that sells water to our retail customers, the cities and districts. And I will also say that we take our urban water management planning process extremely seriously. We work very collaboratively with the contractors that purchase water from us in understanding their population projected population growth over a 25-year horizon and what that will result in demands. And then we are, when we model the water availability from the Russian River and our groundwater wells in the Santa Rosa Plain, we're very conservative on how much, that water being there under the different hydrologic conditions that were required to model to understand water availability, whether it's under a severe drought like 2076, 77, or a very extended 5-year drought that we saw from the late 80s into the 90s, or a normal water year. So I think that's about all I could probably address on that, Director Hopkins.
And I know that you answered this one via text, but other folks might be interested in it as well. Fred had also asked, does the Sonoma Water UWMP show that there is enough water to support projected population growth? Some water alarmists say there is not enough water to support needed housing. And so I was just wondering if you could share that information with the whole community.
Absolutely. So, it's required by state law that every 5 years, both wholesalers and retail water supply providers prepare an urban water management plan. Our last one was prepared in 2020. We're actually in the process of preparing our 2025 urban water management plan. But so as I mentioned, we work very collaboratively and closely with our contractors on what their projected demands are. Based on our 2020 urban water management plan, it showed that we had more than adequate water supply to meet demands under all 3 hydrologic conditions going out to 2045. I would also point out, in every water management plan that we've prepared since 2000, the demands by our retail customers have actually, the projected demands have actually gone down every 5 years. And so we anticipate something very similar in our 2025 urban water management plan.
Great. I have a question for Janine, which is an S2S coalition of agencies and interested parties has been formed to support improving the S2S forecasting through different pilot projects. And I'm wondering how folks who are listening to this webinar could go about learning more about this coalition and its efforts and some of those pilot projects.
Well, so I showed 2 slides in my presentation that had our website for the S2S Coalition in it, including the QR code for it. And if anyone would be interested in joining the coalition, there is a contact link on the website. And, one of the things we do a lot of is writing letters to members of Congress, stressing how important this is, both for authorizing legislation as well as for appropriations. And we would always love to have more participants join our coalition. And I do want to thank Sonoma Water for being such a forward-looking local agency and being so interested and eager to engage in new things and research, whether it's for atmospheric rivers or forecasting or FIRO. You guys are such great partners with us.
Thank you so much, Janine. And so we can also make sure that we have that link up on our website if it isn't already, so that folks can find that directly, especially maybe as paired with our YouTube of this meeting, which we'll have in both English and Spanish versions. Maybe last question for the panel, which is kind of an open-ended one. I feel like so much of the work of all 3 of you experts is really with respect to managing uncertainty, right? Uncertain weather forecasts, uncertain weather, and then also now we have an added uncertainty, which is what is happening at the federal level. And so definitely gotten some concerned questions from constituents about the potential impacts to cuts to NOAA. Will we see attrition of some of the sort of top talent that we've relied on for things like our river forecasting, in the past historically, and what could potentially happen, right? If we actually start to see the shrinking of that agency, the data that we rely on, right? To make these kinds of short-term predictions, at least. So I'm curious if any of you want to comment on your ability to manage uncertainty and and kind of how that's going to look into the future, both with climate change and also with federal funding uncertainty.
Well, maybe I'll start off and take a stab at it. So, in terms of uncertainty in hydrology, California has the largest variability in average annual precipitation of any state in the United States. So we're already familiar with having to deal with uncertainty. And we always tell people plan for the worst. In our case, that could be either the dry side or the wet side, but hope for the best. Worth noting that with respect to forecasting uncertainty, many people don't realize the level of funding or lack of funding that the Weather Service and NOAA as a whole have gotten. The nationwide budget of the Weather Service is only about $1 billion, and most of that is personnel costs. But when you think about the value, the economic value of a weather forecast, and particularly for us in the water sector, how much better forecasting would buy us in terms of not having to construct new infrastructure or using our existing infrastructure more efficiently. There's a huge value proposition there for better forecasting.
Thank you so much, Janine. Don?
Yeah, I would say, that uncertainty is beyond just the National Weather Service. It's a number of federal agencies that Sonoma Waters work closely with in the watershed. It extends to National Marine Fisheries, USGS, even the Army Corps of Engineers on their resources, and how, this has all happened very abruptly in the last, 9 months. And, how we're dealing with that uncertainty is we're back on our heels a bit, but we're applying our resources as much as we can to support those agencies, lobbying in DC on how important those agencies are for bipartisan programs. FERO is an incredibly bipartisan program. And so making sure that folks back in DC understand that, for these programs to be successful and move on, that there's products we need from these agencies and participation we need from these agencies.
Nick?
I think the reality is that both of our facilities were designed in an era that was decades ago by a flood control agency that doesn't want to have flooding at any cost. And we now have these facilities that have a whole lot of airspace along with a whole lot of water space. And FERO, to get at Janine's point, is that we're seeing that value in efficiency versus construction and trying to build our way out of the current moment. We are leveraging our existing infrastructure, and that value added is just very real. So that your point about resiliency and how we manage uncertainty, we are quite close. I remember being evacuated for the Walbridge fire, and I had about 5 people from Sonoma Water calling me. I was expecting sort of updates about the facilities, and their first question was always, where are you? Are you okay? So I think those relationships very much persist and allow us to have frank conversations about our professional anxiety in the moment of a storm or the moment of a drought. And having those relationships is invaluable at working through uncertainty and taking informed risks in the FERO program and elsewhere. It just continues to bring down benefits, or I should say increase benefits, bring down consequences.
I think that note of kind of community inspiration would be a really wonderful note to end on. But I did have one more question sneak in under the wire, and I'm going to share it partly because I'm impressed that they got 3 acronyms in one question sentence. From Mark, we have, does FEMA account for FERO management when developing firm maps, aka when does the Federal Emergency Management Agency account for Forecast-Informed Reservoir Operation management when developing the flood insurance rate maps? And I don't know if anyone happens to know the answer to this question. If not, it's probably something that we can look at and then post in our website afterwards. Is anyone aware of FEMA's engagement on FERO?
I would just say that FEMA assumes that we're operating our facilities for what they're designed to do, which is preventing flood. So we can't implement a management style or rule set that degrades that obligation.
So essentially it goes back to the bottom line hasn't changed with FERO in terms of protecting our flood-prone communities. And that is the assumption going forward. And it is about how can we do that and also maximize the water supply. Well, thank you all so much for joining us for our webinar today. And thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. It's just always great to have such a wealth of information, and to Nick's point, community and trusted relationships between the agencies. So happy Monday, everyone, and have a great week and enjoy what may be some rain coming our way.